Good morning, everyone. Today we will continue the series of lecture Learning from Commons with the honorable presence of the Professor Sheila Foster. This series of lectures is part of the research activities of the project Architecture and Urbanism Address the Social Space in 20th Century, founded by FAPESP and developed in partnership with the universities ETH Zurich, Harvard, TU Delft, KTH in Sweden, and UPM in Spain. The intention of this series of lectures is to broaden our understanding of the urban consequence of the concept of urban commons or commons in general. In this sense, Professor Foster's research on the concept of the city as a common or the co-cities has helped us to understand the possibilities of the Lefebvrean concept of city offre and the height of the city in countries whose inequality and social injustice have increased in the last decades, as in the case in the United States and even more strongly in Brazil. It's an honor for us to be able to count on Professor Foster's and at the end of this series of lectures, which had the participation of the Professor Hastings from ETH, Stavros Stavridis from NTUA Athens, Colin McFarlane, Durham University, and Tom Avermaet from ETH Zurich too. Well, I pass the floor to Professor Anna Cavalcante, who will be the moderator today. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Leandro, as always, for the kind introduction. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone, depending on where you are watching us. We have organized this series of lectures to discuss the topic of the commons from different perspectives, ranging from urban theory, urban design, and urban governance. And we invited specialized researchers to discuss with us this topic. We are very honored to start our conversation today with Professor Sheila Foster from Georgetown University, who addresses the topic of urban commons for more than 10 years. Professor Foster has published many seminal articles and books on the topic of urban commons in the past 10 years. Indeed, she's one of the first authors having published scientific articles about the topic of urban commons. Starting from her article titled Collective Actions and the Urban Commons, which was published in 2011, up to her forthcoming book, The Co-City, Collective Governance, Urban Commons, and Experiments in Social and Economic Pooling, together with Christian Yayon, and to be published by MIT Press. Professor Sheila Foster is a professor of law and public policy at Georgetown University, and in her writings, she explores questions of urban law and governance through the lens of the commons, exemplified by her article, The City as Commons, which was published by Yale Law and Policy Review in 2016, and also her forthcoming book by MIT Press. Professor Foster has also been involved on many levels with public policy. She currently is the chair of the advisory committee of the Global Parliament of Mayors, an advisory board member of the Marin Institute for Urban Management at NYU, and sits on the New York City panel on climate change. She's also a co-director with Christian Yayon of the Laboratory for the Governance of the Commons, the LabGov, and she's currently engaged in the Co-City project, an applied research project on public policies and local projects from over 100 cities around the world. Today, Professor Foster will present a lecture titled Co-Cities, Enable Sustainable Commons in the City. And before giving the floor or the screen to Professor Sheila Foster, I will make some quick remarks. Professor Sheila Foster will talk for about 30 minutes, and her lecture will be followed by a Q&A session. So please feel free to already formulate your questions and post them on the YouTube chat. Your questions can be framed both in English and in Portuguese, and your Portuguese questions will be translated to English. Thank you very much. Please, Professor Sheila Foster, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Professor Cavalcanti, Professor Madrano. I'm going to share my screen in order to get started here because I have a PowerPoint so that hopefully the lecture can be better understood. Do you see my screen?
Not yet.
Not yet. Yes.
Now?
Now it's opening.
Okay.
Yes, now it's it.
Okay, great. Wonderful. So today I want to talk about LabGov's Co-Cities project, which is many years in the making, and it culminates in our forthcoming book for MIT Press. And the structure of the talk is as follows. First, I'm going to start by giving a bit of background, describing the provenance of the project, which began in Italy with my colleague Christian Iaioni, and then spread throughout Europe and other regions, such as North America and South America, and even some efforts in Africa. Second, I will give a brief overview of the empirical project, surveying over 180 cities and 500 or so projects and policies within them, and from which we extracted characteristics of what we would call the co-city. Third, I want to describe the conceptual underpinning of the project, which is rooted in the idea of the urban commons and the city as a commons, and how that has shaped the co-city protocol, which is the basis of the experimentation in various cities. And then if I have time, I will want to situate the co-city normatively, particularly as it relates to how it can serve as a powerful intervention in our current reckoning around racial justice. Okay, let me go to the next slide. Okay, so the framework for the co-city was put into place in practice for the first time in 2012 to about 2014, when Christian Iaioni and I participated as key investigators shaping the experimental grounds that Bologna would become, and then drafting and overseeing the Bologna regulation on the urban commons, which was adopted by the city of Bologna in 2014. The city of Bologna drafted this regulation to recognize and facilitate the right to collective action by residents and others to generate and care for shared urban resources. And the regulation was the cornerstone of this urban economic transformation and civic engagement process, but it was only a part of a larger experimentation. The larger experimentation involved fieldwork activities that consisted of 3 governance labs around the city, a mentoring and co-design program where local officials work together with local NGOs or nonprofits and neighborhood residents with the support of experts and scholars. And in these governance labs, they were able to identify and co-design projects that would revitalize or regenerate 3 types of urban commons: cultural assets, green spaces, and city-owned buildings, to identify the obstacles or administrative bottlenecks that hinders meaningful cooperation between residents and with local officials, to establish public community collaboration around regeneration activities. So these 3 types of projects, again, cultural assets, green spaces, and city-owned buildings, or the revitalization of some buildings for neighborhood use, these 3 types of projects then paved the way for the drafting of the regulation. And so once the regulation was drafted, the central legal tool was to establish public community partnerships via the Pact of Collaborations. So there were pacts of collaborations entered into by the local administration, some mix of city residents, representative civic groups, local nonprofits or foundations, and local businesses. And what you see on the map is what became over 300 pacts of collaboration that were signed. But the pacts were created through a co-design process, including public participation, and they contained a detailed description of the targeted projects that would be co-managed or regenerated as an urban commons. After the successful adoption of the regulation in these pacts, other cities began experimenting with similar regulations, first throughout Italy, and then in other parts of Europe. So the city of Naples, for example, recognizes informal management by city residents of city-owned buildings as urban commons through its civic and collective urban uses policy. The city of Turin has recently approved a regulation that blends the Bologna and Naples approaches and is designed to reduce poverty in the city. Madrid has also passed an ordinance on social cooperation for the urban commons, and Barcelona is implementing a citizen asset program for community use and management. And then other coast cities are emerging, which I'll talk about in North America, but also in Amsterdam, in San Jose, and Accra, and even we have been working with the group in Sao Paulo, actually. So based upon the diffusion, let's say, of these experiments, which began in Bologna, and the interest of other cities and communities to adopt this model or framework of co-governance and commons-based activity, we decided to launch an empirical investigation of the ways that collectively shared and collaboratively stewarded resources can be created and sustained in different political and social and economic contexts. And this is what we're calling the empirical part of our Coast Cities project. This, to date, it's actually over 195 cities. I think I said 180 earlier, and over 550 policies and projects that we've surveyed. And the data set is contained in an open book and published on the web platform commoning.city. Which describes the case studies and the public policies that we mapped. But the data set we've collected is only a starting point. It offers important examples from cities worldwide in which there are emerging or established community or city level initiatives that are pushing urban areas towards new frontiers of what we call social and economic pooling, co-governance, and inclusive and more just city making. And what we've done from the data set is to begin to highlight and extract the common patterns and differences and tools that characterize these efforts around the world. And we created an index measuring the degree to which each of these projects or policy aligns with what we have defined as design principles of the coast city. So what these next two slides will show, starting with this one, are some of the protocol, what we call the coast city protocol. The protocol on this side is slide is very much a 1.0 version. It's not so much prescriptive as it is reflective of our observations from the empirical aspect of the project and our experience working on the ground in different cities. It identifies the necessary conditions for the establishment of a polycentric governance of networked urban commons, and it's composed of 5 design principles, including collective governance, enabling state, pooling economies, experimentalism, and tech justice, as well as what we call a coast city cycle, which is in almost all of the projects that we've worked in. We've started with the Ostrom, Eleanor Ostrom had this idea of cheap talking, to reach out to communities and stakeholders, mapping assets and mapping resources, practicing by building trust, first with communities and other stakeholders, to prototyping a model of an urban commons, or in the case of Bologna, a regulation, by testing it and then collecting data about whether it works, and then by modeling it. So this is what we call the Coast Cities Protocol. And we also have this toolkit, which is really our identification of recurring legal, financial, institutional, and digital or technological mechanisms that we have identified from the empirical surveys that contribute to the construction and then the diffusion of urban commons around the city to create coast cities, or the city as commons. So that's the empirical part of the project. What I want to talk about now is the kind of underpinning, the conceptual underpinning. And the coast city is rooted ultimately in the conceptual pillars of the urban commons and the city as a common. Starting, as the introduction noted, about 10 years ago, we, both separately as scholars and then together, myself and Christian Iaioni, have been exploring the idea that urban infrastructure, including land, including available vacant structures or buildings, including open space, can be cooperatively governed by city residents, most often sharing this responsibility with other actors depending on the scale of the resource, much as in Elinor Ostrom's groundbreaking work, which I'll talk about in a second. And our study of the urban commons first began as separate bodies of study, investigating how different kinds of urban assets, such as community gardens, parks, neighborhoods, and urban infrastructure, such as urban roads, etc., could be conceived as common resources. And then, of course, we later joined myself and Professor Iaioni to conceive the city itself as a commons, as a shared infrastructure on which a variety of urban actors can cooperate and collaborate, and where various initiatives of collective action can emerge, flourish, and become sustainable. And we argue that thinking of the city as a commons is a way to acknowledge that the city is generative, capable of providing for different social and economic needs of its populations. And in thinking about the city as a commons, of course, we walk in the footsteps of Elinor Ostrom, right? Who overturned decades of economic thought, which suggested that there were only two ways to manage and govern shared resources, either through state or public control or private ownership. She, of course, found examples all over the world of resource users cooperatively managing and stewarding a range of natural resources, uncultivated lands, fisheries, forests, irrigation systems, and that they did so using rich mixtures of public and private mechanisms or instrumentalities. And in her examples, resource users devise and enforce their own rules for sustainably using and sharing what she called common pool resources without over-consuming or depleting them, and also making sure that they're available for future generations. And importantly, the rules and the community's right to enforce them were recognized by external governing bodies and public agencies. And sometimes these rules of the resource users of the community that were governing the resource, often they were nested, she said, within larger government structures, for instance, like a city, akin to what Bologna has done with its pacts of collaboration. And this is what others have referred to as constructed commons, right? When we refer to the urban commons, we refer to commons or collective and collaboratively managed resources that emerge or result from a process of bringing together communities and other stakeholders to co-design and co-produce shared common goods and services at different scales in the urban environment. In other words, these constructed commons are quite different from the natural resource commons that were the subject of Elinor Ostrom's work, right? Identified a number of kinds of constructed commons in the urban environment that range from shared limited equity housing, like community land trusts, to wireless mesh or broadband or community broadband networks, to energy microgrids that are governed by communities and other essential urban infrastructure. And some of these urban commons, these new urban commons that we've mapped, are longstanding enterprises that date back decades, and others are fairly new and experimental. But what they all share in common is that they're created from existing urban infrastructure, what we would call, again, vacant land, abandoned buildings, or defunct park or open space, and that this urban infrastructure is then utilized to generate new goods and services for communities that allow them to survive and flourish. So why do I say urban infrastructure includes vacant land? That's because, at least in the United States, where we now have brought the co-city model, even the most successful cities like New York City contain acres and acres, thousands of acres of vacant properties that communities try to put to use. So here's a map of New York City. The city Comptroller, the agency, recently released an audit of all of the vacant land that the city owns, because sometimes, private actors have abandoned the land, or sometimes it can be an old public property or land. But there's almost 30,000 private parcels, as well as even more formerly public land, or land that has been public. And the fact that New York City has this amount of vacant land and structures suggests the scale of the phenomenon that I'm talking about today, which is to say that this idea that there's available urban infrastructure from which to construct commons. So, similarly, if you look at even a city like Detroit, the other end of the spectrum, not a successful city, but a struggling city, this is even more so, right? Detroit has more than 120,000 vacant lots, about 40 square miles, or a third of the city. So even in Detroit, again, there are communities that are utilizing these vacant lots and sometimes vacant homes for housing, for urban farms, and for other uses to allow communities, again, to thrive and to survive. So in many respects, this type of vacant available land and structure in cities, I've argued, is property in transition, right? Most of this land was privately owned, but at some point had fallen out of private hands, usually from some combination of abandonment or tax delinquency. In a city like Detroit, from white flight to the suburbs and decades of disinvestment in these neighborhoods. And this land and structure has ended up in the public domain, in the domain of the local authority. So as some scholars like Saskia Sassen have questioned, who owns the city? Who owns this land and urban infrastructure? Well, as we know, neighboring residents and communities, or as I've said, often begin to treat this property in transition as an open access resource or a common pool resource that can serve the needs of underserved communities that lack green space, healthy food options, and even housing. And we see this happening all over the US, in cities like Oakland, Los Angeles, and Philadelphia, where Moms for Housing on this screen, mothers with children in their care, are leading the movement to occupy vacant homes, for instance. Homes and structures that are sometimes were privately owned, but were abandoned or tax foreclosed, and sometimes owned by the state itself. In Philadelphia, by the Philadelphia Housing Authority, or in California by the state authority. And the activists are making claims to this property and public resource as a human right, part of the right to the city, right to reclaim or reappropriate city resources, inhabit and share its spaces, and actively participate in the formation and use of those resources in spaces. One group calls itself reclaimers of this land. And what we see is the willingness increasingly of local governments and cities to use things like community land trusts, in which to allow these communities to utilize this land and also to govern it through these mechanisms such as community land trusts. So Moms for Housing, which were occupying a house or houses in Oakland, California, eventually struck a deal to negotiate the sale of the house to the Oakland Community Land Trust that would hold these homes as affordable over the long term for housing. So these land trusts, these community land trusts, are set up to work with local governments to transfer available land or lots to the trust to oversee their development or preservation as affordable housing, affordable commercial or artistic space, or green space, which allow communities to not just stay in place, it's anti-gentrification, but also, again, to flourish. And the land trust is a steward. It remains a steward by holding title to the land, right? So the land trust owns the land, but giving the residents or people using the space long-term ground leases with a right to, if it's housing, resell for limited equity. So it takes the land and the resources off of the extractive market, and holds it as affordable, while allowing people who are using the land to transfer or resell it to the next person to keep it affordable, but only to gain a limited amount of equity if it's sold as housing, for instance. But importantly, from a commons perspective as well, the governing board is made up of a third of users of the resource, a third of the general community in the neighborhood, and a third of the general public, usually represented by public officials or people who provide funding. In the United States, the longest standing successful community land trust is outside of Boston, something called the Dudley Street Land Trust. And it's one of the most cited examples, although now there are many, many more in cities across the country. On the left side of the screen, you'll see what was the area that had a lot of vacant land. The Dudley Neighborhood Group worked with state and local government to assemble and convey to the land trust 15 acres of vacant lots owned by the city, and 15 acres that were privately owned, but most of which had tax liens against them. And the trust, which with the help of public funds and private foundation grants, developed what you see on the right is what's called an urban village that's in the land trust, which consists of hundreds of affordable housing units, 6 public green common spaces, 2 community centers, an urban farm, refurbished schoolyards, and numerous playgrounds. So this trust controls over 30 acres of land in what's called the Dudley Triangle. And the housing includes 97 home ownership units, 77 limited equity cooperative units, 55 rental apartments, and about 100 individually owned homes. Even for the poorest families who are making about $30,000 to $60,000 a year for a family of 4. Another example quickly of a different kind of trust, land trust, is this one from the city of Chicago. It's called Neighbor Space. And it's an urban land trust that preserves existing community gardens and open space, mostly in communities of color, particularly in areas where there's a lack of open space. And this land trust was actually created by 3 government agencies: the City of Chicago, the Park District of Chicago, and the Forest Preserve District of the county. And they work together with community leaders and residents to identify land that was already being utilized as gardens and other community space. And they put that land in a land trust. And it's now over 115 plots or lots scattered across the city of Chicago, most of which are community gardening projects. Put it in the land trust. Neighbor Space, the land trust, operates as a higher level authority, helping the community members to clear the land, to transfer title to the trust, and to give them materials and other support. But they leave the rule setting and the management of the individual plots to the local stewards, is what they call them. So the community group acts as stewards over the land and exercise collective governance over the plot. So this is a good example of what Eleanor Ostrom referred to as nested, a nested system of governance in which you have different communities governing different assets that are an urban commons that is nested within a larger structure like this land trust. So land trusts are only one example of these emerging urban commons that we have found around the world. Another example are mesh networks, which have been established in many European and US cities, including the famed community mesh network in Red Hook, Brooklyn. And there's one in Detroit, Michigan, that are designed to overcome the digital divide because they provide connectivity to about 40% of residents in Detroit, for instance, who do not have internet access. The mesh network in Berlin, Germany, provides vital internet service to newly arrived migrants living in refugee shelters. So this mesh networking, again, is built from existing urban infrastructure and the combined efforts of community actors, and sometimes private and public property owners who grant access to buildings and structures to mount access points to create these mesh networks. In this model, no one owns the infrastructure. It's open and free access, but everyone who wants to access and contribute with their own resources to run the network is part of the governance of that network. And I have been working on a community broadband network, what we call an edge cloud network in Harlem. This is one of our co-city projects in the US, funded by the United States National Science Foundation, a government agency which utilizes the infrastructure of a smart city, which New York is, to create a community-governed broadband network to bridge the digital divide in Harlem and Upper Manhattan that leaves 1/3 of households and families without access to broadband internet at home. And we're working with a number of actors, the city of New York, the community of Harlem, including a nonprofit group called Silicon Harlem, which is a community-based group, as well as Microsoft, which gave Edge Cloud servers, which donated them to put in buildings all over Harlem, including public housing. And what it will do is this network will be a community network that will be governed by members of the community. So happy to answer any questions about that. So what we're calling, again, constructed commons, community land trust, limited equity forms of co-housing, community mesh and broadband networks, and other kinds of co-governed goods and services. These are the kinds of common goods that we have seen co-produced and co-created in cities all over the world from existing infrastructure. These goods are produced and managed through different forms of pooling and the cooperation of at least 5 possible actors, which are, public authorities, private or commercial businesses, often civil society organizations, community actors or social innovators, and knowledge institutions such as schools, universities, institutes, and other knowledge institutions. And these are giving birth to what we call local peer-to-peer experimental, physical, digital, and institutional platforms that foster the social innovation in urban goods and services, spurring collaborative economies as a driver of local community development. And from that, we've extracted these 5 governance principles of the co-cities. Again, collective governance or co-governance, which refers to the presence of a multi-stakeholder governance scheme, whereby the community emerges as an actor and partners with 4 other possible collaborators that I just mentioned. Principle 2 is the enabling state. It expresses the role of the state in facilitating the creation of urban commons and supporting collective governance arrangements. Principle 3 is social and economic pooling, referring to the ways that individuals and institutions pool their efforts to create these collaborative or circular economies, which are non-extractive and sustainable. Principle 4 is experimentalism, which is the presence of adaptive, place-based, and iterative approaches to designing these legal and policy innovations that enable the urban commons. And principle 5 is tech justice. We found in a lot of these projects the necessity of access, participation, and co-management or co-ownership of technological and digital urban infrastructure and data as in a driver of cooperation and co-creation of urban commons. So that's the idea of the co-cities. I do want to say or end just by talking about something that we in this country are dealing with, and that is the normative implications of this framework for racial justice, which is something that I know is a concern in Brazil and certainly in the U.S. Can the co-city, can this model be a solution to enduring racial inequality? We think it can be, although it's not a panacea. For example, as this slide shows, the creation of community land trusts and limited equity cooperatives that enable low-income residents of color or communities to control and govern their land is part of a larger unfinished racial and economic justice project in America. This author, Jessica Gordon-Nimbard's work has demonstrated that these cooperative ownership mechanisms, like community land trusts, have their origins in the fight for Black civil rights and economic equality in America. So African Americans have had a long and rich history of cooperative ownership in reaction to the failure of markets and the persistence of racial discrimination. There's also terrific work by Amanda Huron in Washington, D.C., this wonderful book where she explores the use of limited equity cooperatives in Washington and largely Black communities as a response to the threat of gentrification. And the goal, she writes, is to transform land that was once treated as a commodity and from which they were in danger of being displaced into land that they can exercise some control over and keep accessible to their communities over the long run. And that cannot be sold on the open market. And then here's an example of what we see recently. This is Africa Town in Seattle. We're beginning to see local governments utilize land trusts to make bold investments in African American communities as a response to systemic racism. So the city of Seattle announced last year it would transfer $1 million and some old public buildings like a fire station that is no longer being used to this community land trust in a historically Black neighborhood. It's called the Africa Town Community Land Trust. And the grant is designed to help the land trust develop affordable rental housing, home ownership, and business opportunities. And the fire station will be used to establish a center for cultural innovation in the neighborhood, a collaborative effort between the community and the city's Department of Planning and Community Development. And then finally, I'll end here. I'm working on a project in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, a 4-mile stretch in a city that is a tale of two cities, which is one part of the city is very white and rich, and the other is very Black and poor. And this part, Plank Road, the Plank Road area, is an old commercial area that lacks, as you see here, has a lot of blight and vacancy, lacks sometimes adequate street lighting, sidewalks, etc. But we have undergone a community process here to use things like land trust and a combined land trust and land bank to revitalize this area in the mode of the urban commons, so the community is a steward over its own regeneration. And so here are some of the prototypes that we've been working with the community on. A pocket part that gives them green space and that also helps with flooding, which is a risk from climate change. And this is a co-designed one with the community and other actors down there. And then a combined community land bank land trust, which I'm happy to talk about, which allows them to utilize all the vacant land, about 90 lots of vacant land, which is now in a land bank, to allow them to use that in a land trust to develop the goods and services that they need. Okay, so I'm going to stop sharing and I will stop there and happy to answer your questions.
Thank you very much, Professor Foster, for the wonderful lecture. I will open now our Q&A session, so I will remind the public to feel free to formulate their questions both in English and Portuguese. And while people are preparing their questions, I would really like to know from you more about the role of the state in the production of a more sustainable city with the commons. We have seen in many examples in the coast cities and also LabGov examples the importance of the role of the state as an enabler of these common actions in the cities. And this contrasts a little bit with the notion of Ostrom's notion that the state and the market are two antagonists of the common. So I would like you to expand a little bit more this notion. This is one of the notions that the students are referring to most often in our course, the course I organized together with Professor Leandro Medrano here at FAU, and we would really like to know that from you. Thank you very much.
State. So first, starting with Ostrom. In her work, importantly, a lot of her cases were community governed in the absence of a state, right? Over natural resources that were common pool resources, which were non-owned resources and really non-regulated in some ways. But she importantly found that when these communities were trying to co-govern larger resources such as water basins, you needed the state, that they had to do so with the state, right? And also that even with the smaller community governed resources, the state recognized those. So she's talking about a dichotomy of market state in which neither is the monopoly actor, and she's locating the commons in between. And we've argued in our work that when you come into the city, right, you have to depart from even Ostrom, because what do you have in cities? You have, first of all, a highly privatized, at least in the United States, but a highly privatized landscape in which you have private actors that are owning a lot of the assets, but you have, even when they don't, you have a state that is not only owning or has control over, as I've just talked about, even vacancy, control of the land, but owns and regulates a lot of the land. So we're not talking about a pre-political common resource as you would find in the natural resources area. Pre-political meaning just existing out of nature. These are, so to construct commons, urban commons, these are constructed commons, not natural, then the state has to be a facilitator and an enabler of this. And so you can't ignore the role of the state, I think, in the urban environment because of the tremendous role that the state plays vis-a-vis these resources.
Thank you very much for your wonderful reply. I think it's very clear to see the role of the state within the construction of the commons. I would really like to know, expanding a little bit more on this question, if the question of scale plays an important role within this intermediation between the state and the collaborative actions and the co-productive actions of the citizen in the city. Thank you very much.
Sure, that's another great question. And that's our move from the urban commons to the city as a common. So for individual urban commons, a community garden, let's say, right? So one of the things we say is when you have all of this available infrastructure, whether it's the mother squatting in the house or the creating community gardens, sometimes communities are using these assets as a common pool resource, as an open access resource, as a true commons, as a traditional commons. And they may even be able to create their own rules and govern that. But to move from individual instances of urban commons to running the city as a commons, or to having commons disseminate across the cities and those being sustainable, again, I think you need a facilitative state, not just because of the idea of allowing access to the land or the resource itself, which is often under the state control, but because of all of the regulations that are in place. So for instance, in the Chicago context with community land trusts, a sociologist did this study of the gardens across Chicago and found that the gardeners had to interact with the state to, even if it's how do you connect water and to get water out of the ground, for instance, or just to set up the garden and to run it, you have to negotiate all of these regulations and rules. And sometimes you need an exception to them. So you can't ignore the state, even if you're creating one urban common, one community garden. So the state, as in Chicago, with this citywide land trust, it's a really good example of the state facilitating the city as a commons, right? Facilitating over 120 sites that can be stewarded and run as an urban commons at different places across a city of millions. So the state has to be an intermediary, and that's why one of our important design principles is an enabling state.
Thank you very much, Professor Foster. We have a question from the public. There's a question from Andre S. He asks you, do the CLTs have more leverage in discussions, debate with the state and its intervention on the region in contrast with regular community associations? If so, in which ways?
Well, that's an interesting question, because you have to create the CLTs, and often they're created, as in the Dudley Street example in Boston. That was created from a Dudley Street neighborhood association, the DSNI, and they worked with the state and others to create the land trust. And then, of course, once you have a land trust, it's its own entity. It's outside of the state. It's governed as a nonprofit, and if it's a true community land trust, it has a significant community governance element. So that neighborhood association then became part of the board, and the people on the board of that land trust represent different groups in the neighborhood. So, so I don't think it's whether the land trust or the community group has a different relationship with the state. It's, I think, from the beginning, can community groups work with the state and other actors to construct this thing called a land trust? Do they have enough power? And I think the issue of power and capacity at the neighborhood level is a real issue. And so what we're doing in Baton Rouge, for instance, is that there's an effort to work with the community actors to build capacity to be able to become actors, powerful actors. And so when a community may not have as much capacity, may not be as organized, may not have strong neighborhood associations or groups. In Harlem, for instance, they do, right? The group there called Silicon Harlem is a convener of the community. They can convene thousands of community members. They can bring the community together. They can call local politicians. But in Baton Rouge, that's not the case, right? You don't have those kind of powerful groups. So you have to work to help community actors in those cases, help them with the capacity to do that, to be able to construct these instruments of co-governance like land trusts.
Thank you, Professor Sheila.
Sure.
I'd like to ask a question, please. Well, thanks again for this talk. Well, the concept of commons began to be more explored in Brazil after the book of Rebel Cities by David Haft, who is a widely read author around here. Rebel Cities was launched at the time when several protests seemed to indicate a profound change in the neoliberalism and the role of the states as a social regulator. Unfortunately, what we have seen is the opposite. In some countries, the extreme right is growing and frightening rate. Brazil is an example, as we see in the current disaster government. On the other hand, recent reports by the World Inequality Lab have revealed that the inequality has increased in the recent years, especially during the current pandemic. How have you worked with the concept of co-cities in such a diverse context? In other words, did you notice any transformation in the concept of the city or the co-city during the years that you have developed your research?
How is the city transformed over those years, you mean? Or the concept of the city?
The concept of co-city and the place of the state in the last 10 years, for example.
Yes.
That we have seen a dramatic change in
I don't know. So I've learned a lot over the 10 years, in part through this empirical part of the project and looking in different political economic contexts. So the one thing we've learned is we don't believe in what we call cut and paste. So one of the things that happened after Bologna, especially in Italy, is a lot of cities took the regulation and literally cut and paste it. And no, we think this is an adaptive model. Every place may not need a regulation. That may not be the way into the coast city. And in fact, focusing on the regulation in Bologna made a little invisible the governance labs in the city and the neighborhood labs. People were focused on this piece of law, but not on the commoning that was happening on the setting up institution. So the one thing is that we learned it should be experimental and adaptive. And because in every context, whether it's Brazil or whether it's Africa, we were working in Accra, Ghana, or whether it's Baton Rouge, even between the South and North here in the US, it's a very different approach. Because why? Communities are very different. Local governments are very different. The authority to do this can vary. In Brazil, it may be at the regional level, it may be at the city level. So that's why we talk about a co-city cycle. That's the other thing we learned, is to give people a kind of an idea of that it's a process, right? It's not a cut and paste. So that's one thing we learned. The other thing that I see that has changed a lot is the willingness. So in the end, I talk about racial justice in the US. There's definitely in the last 5 years, and certainly in the last 2, been a real willingness for cities to facilitate, to enable this. So New York City, for instance, last year gave millions of dollars to help community groups and communities plan for CLTs, right? They then voted up more money, right? Just this last session. So they're facilitating this now, and they're more interested in doing this. So I do think I believe in bottom up, not top down. And so I think you see movement in local governments because there's a lot of pressure from a lot of communities and groups to want to have more than participatory governments. They want more than that, more than participatory budgeting, which New York has, but they want to co-create, to be more aligned. They don't use this language of the commons or the right to the city, but I think they want to be more aligned with that idea that they're co-creators and co-governors, not just participators in things that are already designed by the city, and the city's just asking for their participation. So I do see a shift in many kinds of cities over time.
Okay, thank you so much.
Sure.
Thank you, Professor Foster. We have 2 comments from the public. The first comment and question is from Marcos Felipe Alda Silva. He says, "Hi, Professor Foster. It was a great presentation. I would like to know what is your opinion about the intentional communities movement, housing, eco-village, ecopolis, etc., framed as a systemic model to deal with our crisis in the mainstream society?" The second question is from Miguel Mermejo, and he comments and questions, "Regarding the agents that involve the process of discussion and management of city space in our context, it seems to form an arena of dispute between agents. The state, with its regulatory role, segmented market capital, and organized social movements and self-managed. Is there any example in the context of Latin America of a movement of cities that escapes from this notion of revitalization, requalification, inserted in the practice of strategic marketing and urban planning? Perhaps the struggle of militancy movements in the field of intangible heritage, such as the LGBTQIA, would be a movement in this direction?" And this is his question. Thank you very much.
Sure. So on the first question, eco-villages, eco-housing, I think these are all great models. And again, I have to look at these things in the context of a particular setup, because, for instance, there are now cities are adapting housing land trusts, but they're not community-based. They have nothing to do with communities. So I worry about models that use the language of the commons or use the language of co-governance, but they're not really rooted in community. They're not really changing the kind of governance infrastructure of the commons, right? So what, Atlanta, Dallas, they have these land trusts. What they're doing is they're putting housing in a trust to keep it affordable. That's a great thing. But the governance model, but there's one or two people governing the land trust. It's not coming from community. So, I know that there's lots of tiny houses, eco-villages. I think some of these are interesting models, but it's hard to answer the question in the abstract. I think that's why we have design principles, because we want to root this in these principles, not that we've created, but that we've extracted from what we call exemplary cases of urban commons and the city as a commons around the world, that we think are really involved or do reflect the kinds of urban commons that we've been theorizing and writing about, which is to say that they involve true collective co-governance, right? That they do involve an enabling state, not a monopoly state, right? That they do have an element of justice, social justice, et cetera. So that's what I would say, is that I would refer to a set of principles that I care about and then look at the model to see if they have any of those elements. On the second question, so it's a long question, so let me answer with how I think they're asking. So you ended with the question of social movements, including the LGBTQIA plus movement. I do think that the commons, I believe in ground up solutions, right? And no, you can't escape the state. I don't think you can escape the market these days, actually, because, and I think these movements suggest that you can't also escape the community, right? Because there is pushback, there are mobilizations. And so what we're interested in is seeing where the state and the market take a step back and allow communities to be a driver. And then figuring out what they need from the state and what they need from market actors. And all market actors aren't the same, right? So in Harlem, for instance, Microsoft donated dozens of servers, right? Cloud servers to this project. But they did so on the terms of the project, right? So there were, we're setting up a innovative, what's called edge cloud network, where the cloud is not out there, but it's in your building. And every community can govern what's in that cloud and also the applications, but you need the servers. So there's an example of, we created the design with the 5 actors. The city enabled it because they own the smart city infrastructure that we need to tap into. A private actor, donated the servers, but again, it's on the terms of the project itself. So where is that possible? It depends on where you're, situated. And this is the point, the adaptive part of this. What is possible in your country or in your region? So I do know, from working with catalytic communities in Brazil, that there's an effort to bring community land trust to some of the, favelas. And, they recognize that that's a different model than we have in the US, in part because the house is already owned, right, by people in the favelas. So what does it look like, let's say, to transfer their titles to a land trust? That's a different model here, where we're starting out with putting vacant land or vacant houses in, and then the trust owning those from the start. So that's an example of adaptiveness, right? You have to adapt these models to, and it's hard to answer what works or what doesn't unless you're in that context. But again, there are principles. I always go back to the design principles that reflect the idea of the commons.
Thank you, Professor Foster. I think we are getting to the end of our lecture. It has been a wonderful way to close our series of lectures, and we hope to continue this discussion with you. And on behalf of FAU, we thank you very much for your presence today, and we are very honored I would like also to thank all the media staff from FAU, Bárbara, Lorine, Diogenes, Márcia Regina, Rose, and all the people who are working behind to make this happen. And yes, I will close now our series of lecture. Professor Leandro, would you like to make some final words?
No, just thank you again for you and Professor Sheila Foster and for all the group who helped us to this series of lecture. Thank you again for everybody.
Thank you
Thank
very
you for
much.
inviting me. Thank you for inviting me. It was my pleasure.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye.
See you. Bye. Thank you.